Young, first to you. Tell us what's happening in the protest there. And one key question I have actually is local law enforcement having trouble policing this situation?
Well, since you asked about local law enforcement, let's start with LAPD. I'm standing outside the Metropolitan Detention Center. There was a protest out here, but I'm going to quote LAPD. In their news release, they said last night, yes, there was some spray painting, but what they did was this incident wrapped without incident. So what happened here was, again, without incident. The LAPD is describing it that way. There was an unlawful assembly, and in protest, that does happen. But as far as what the LAPD said, that they are viewing this as something that was manageable and something that they could handle and that they are ready to respond to. But I want to show you what the National Guard response is. Again, outside the Metropolitan Detention Center. I was talking about the spray painting. You can see some of this. It's this entire block appears to be tagged. But take a look at these officers. These are soldiers, rather. You can see what there's about maybe 25 of them standing here in quite a display of a show of force. And each of these soldiers, if Mike, you can zoom in a little bit, they're each carrying a long stick and a rifle. Each one of them is carrying a rifle. It appears to be a lethal rifle. We don't know what the status of those weapons are, but they certainly are here with their uniforms on and an incredible show of force. Armored vehicles also positioned outside of the Metropolitan Detention Center. So what is happening here today? I'm going to have you sweep across this way and just take a look over here. We have a very small handful of people. When I first got here, there was more press than members of the public. There are a couple women who are shouting at the soldiers. There has not been any confrontation. You can still smell from last night a little bit of the pepper spray that was used, some of the anti-riot measures that were deployed last night. But this appears to be very, very peaceful as of right now. But what I can tell you just from what I'm seeing here, Jim, an incredible show of force here in the streets of Los Angeles. I went by City Hall. We zoomed through downtown, and so far everything here is peaceful. Jim?
Kyung, thanks so much for that update. Good to have you there on the ground. Please keep yourself and the team safe. I want to go to Betsy Klein now. Now, Betsy, of course, this administration typically has quite a deferential approach to law enforcement. As Kyung was just saying there, LAPD says they have the situation under control, though now you have those uniformed National Guardsmen there. How is the administration responding to this, and how are they justifying this deployment?
Well, Jim, there has been so much pressure on the Trump administration to ramp up its deportation efforts. President Trump campaigned on that, and in the first months of his presidency, of his second term, he has fallen far short of his stated goals. So we have been seeing increased deportation efforts from ICE, a major crackdown in recent weeks, all of this leading up to the protests that we have been seeing in the Los Angeles area. Now, President Trump making that decision Saturday night to deploy 2,000 members of the National Guard. Members because in his view, and the White House and other top Republican officials, Californian officials, including the governor, Gavin Newsom, were not doing enough to tamp down that violence. But this, of course, is such an intrinsically political move. A president hasn't unilaterally called in the National Guard since the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And California Governor Gavin Newsom has said that the move would only exacerbate tensions on the ground. Of course, all of this comes as the Trump administration is weighing massive cuts that could happen in the coming days to federal grants for the state of California. But Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says that all of this is a matter of security. Take a look.
These 2,000 National Guard soldiers that are being engaged today are ones that are specifically trained for this type of crowd situation. National Guard soldiers are there to provide security for operations and to make sure that we have peaceful protests. So that's what their work is. And I won't get more specific on that just because we never do when it comes to law enforcement operations.
Now, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says that active duty Marines stationed at Camp Pendleton are on, quote, high alert to support as needed. And as for how long this might go on, the presidential memorandum signed last night by President Trump states that National Guard service will last at least 60 days and is up to the discretion of the Defense Secretary. I also want to read you a post to social media from FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. He says, quote, we are not stopping or slowing down. We are not intimidated or apprehensive. Illegal immigration operations will continue, and anyone using violence to obstruct or impede these operations will be investigated and prosecuted. Of course, all of this as President Trump and top officials, including Hegseth and Vice President J.D. Vance, are set to huddle this evening at Camp David. Jim.
Our thanks to Betsy Klein. Kyung La. CNN Chief Law Enforcement and Intelligence Analyst John Miller joins me now for his perspective. Of course, John served a long time in the NYPD. John, just first, if I could draw on your long experience here. Of course, that's just a snapshot, what we saw there with Kyung, the size of the protests and those soldiers there seems to be quite a calm situation. But based on what you saw over the last 24 to 48 hours, was that a situation out of the control of local law enforcement, which we should note, the LAPD has its own riot control units and units trained for riot control. Did the instability there justify or require additional resources from where you're sitting?
I wouldn't say so. And I also served 3 years in the LAPD as the head of the Criminal Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau, and worked with the LAPD through many large demonstrations at the beginning of the Iraqi war and other things. LAPD, by most estimates, had this under control last night. But what we're seeing is a couple of things. Let's break it down because it can get confusing. Number one, LAPD's response on Friday night when demonstrators converged on the federal building, when federal officers were firing pepper balls and gas agents at them. The federal government said it took them hours to get there. LAPD says not true. We were there within 51 minutes, which is the amount of time it takes, according to the LAPD manual, which I'm pretty familiar with, unless it's changed, 45 minutes to organize a mobile field force drawn from patrol units from across the city to get assembled, get to the location, and take control from another agency. They were there within 51 minutes. They said they were hampered by traffic and then getting through the crowds with their vehicles. And then when they got out, they were in a gas environment where they didn't have the proper equipment or gas masks and had to call Metro in to stabilize that. But since that time, they have been operating in their normal disorder control, operations, procedures. So why is the National Guard there? So you've got three things. Number one, they are there, according to the people I've spoken to, both in local and federal side, for force protection. When ICE agents go out on massive operations or big operations, they are there to form that perimeter and make sure that those ICE agents aren't interfered with by some crowd that gathers. The LAPD will not participate in civil immigration matters. When they call for help, though, and say, we need police assistance here, the LAPD will respond to that. And third, when it comes to any kind of protest or disorder, the LAPD should be first in line there, not the National Guard.
One just very basic question. You heard Kristi Noem say that this National Guard unit is trained in crowd control. What degree of training would they have as compared to LAPD's own trained units? And would those weapons that Kyung La saw that would they have live ammunition in them?
They appear to have live ammunition in them. The magazines are in place. And, if you look at that third soldier from the left, in his magazines, you can see the shell casings from what appear to be live rounds. The training they would have, Jim, would be similar to law enforcement disorder control in terms of formation, about how to push back a crowd, and so on. But what they don't have, where they do have the training, what they don't have is they don't have the experience. Right. National Guard troops don't have regular experience the way American police does, especially in the last few years, of dealing with mass protests. And, that's where you run into things that are making officials on the ground there uncomfortable, which is, we're a country that lived through Kent State in 1970, where National Guard troops opened fire on a college campus. What happens in this situation when they're on the front line, somebody throws something from the back of the crowd, it hits somebody and they go down? So law enforcement is concerned that they have adequate resources in terms of law enforcement there, and that this is not necessarily necessary.
Yeah. And listen, the history shows just how seldom this has happened, particularly how seldom it's happened over the objections or without the explicit request of state or city officials. And you have to go all the way back, as Kyung La noted, to the civil rights protests in the mid-1960s. John Miller, I know I am able to bring you back later this hour and beyond. Thanks so much for joining. We're going to continue to keep our eyes on the situations there in L.A.
With me now to discuss, CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel, good to have you. First question here. Is this, in your opinion, an overreaction, the president's authorization to deploy National Guard troops?
Yeah, good morning, Victor. I think it is. So, when you look at the report that Julia just gave us here, and you look at the basic situation in Los Angeles, it is nowhere near the last time federal troops and National Guard were deployed in Los Angeles, and that's the Rodney King situation back in the 1990s. So the situation is completely different. There you actually had looting, you actually had destruction of property and the loss of life. In this particular case, you don't have anything like that at all. And it does look, at least from the vantage points that we have here, that the local authorities in Los Angeles do have this under control. So it does seem like an overreaction, and it seems like an unnecessary use of federal power to federalize the National Guard and bring them in.
And from my understanding, when the National Guard troops were deployed in the early 90s to California, that was with the request, or under the request, of the then governor. And so there was an organized cooperation between local law enforcement and the National Guard. What is, and it's been so long since this has come without the request of the governor, what is the cooperation between the military and local law enforcement who didn't ask for these National Guard troops to come?
Yeah, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. So the local commanders on the ground, when the National Guard troops actually get there, are going to have to work something out so that things actually work smoothly. Because you're right, in the 1990s and the early 90s, it was the governor of California who requested of the president of the United States the deployment of not only National Guard troops, which the governor controlled in that moment, but also federal troops. And you look at the absolute differences. So the local commanders, when the National Guard units arrive there, are going to have to work with the LA sheriffs and the LAPD in order to actually make sure that there's no conflict, that the rules of engagement, for example, are clarified, that the troops understand what their roles are, and if they're smart, they're going to stay back and let the local law enforcement handle things unless local law enforcement asks them to step in specific situations. That's going to be the key to all of this. And if that can't be done, then we're going to see not only coordination issues, but the potential for some serious mistakes being made as well from a law enforcement as well as military perspective.
And of course, no one wants to see that happen. Now, that's the National Guard. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, posted on social media that if violence continues, active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton will also be mobilized. They are on high alert. And that's a separate conversation here. What is the scope of authority, considering the constraints and directions of Posse Comitatus? What can they do if the Marines are deployed into LA County?
So this gets into some questionable areas when it comes to the laws. So what can happen is that under the Posse Comitatus rules, federal troops, meaning soldiers, Marines, and any other element of the Department of Defense, actually have no law enforcement powers unless there is an exception made. So there are possible exceptions to the Posse Comitatus rules, but they have to be handled on a case-by-case basis. And the other aspect of this would be if another law, namely the Insurrection Act, is invoked, and that would then allow for troops to be used in a law enforcement capacity. But it seems, based on what we know so far, at least, it seems like insurrection is not exactly what's happening in Los Angeles. So it would be a stretch to actually invoke the Insurrection Act and make it possible for the Marines to be used in a law enforcement capacity. They can be used in a support capacity, like we see along the border with Mexico, but it is something that is really based on the laws that we currently have on the books, not a legal move unless certain exceptions are made.
And some of these assets would be used primarily to protect federal buildings, federal assets first, before engaging with civilians?
That would be the wisest way to do this. If you're going to do something like this, you protect the federal areas first, like the federal courthouses, things like that, and that would be one possibility that they kind of serve as a shield, if you will, for those installations. But if they go into a direct law enforcement role, that would then be a violation of the Posse Comitatus laws, and that would be a problem.
All right, Colonel Cedric Leighton, thanks so much.
In a dramatic escalation overnight, President Trump deployed the National Guard to quash ongoing protests in Southern California. His decision to send 2,000 troops to Los Angeles followed 2 days of protests against sweeping federal immigration raids in the area. Now, hundreds of protesters clashed with local police and federal immigration agents as law enforcement used tear gas and flashbang grenades to disperse the crowds, some of whom vandalized buildings and threw objects. Now, it's the first time a president had taken the rare step to take control of the state's National Guard since the deadly Rodney King riots in 1992. Now, overnight, California Governor Gavin Newsom called Trump's decision, quote, purposefully inflammatory, and said it would, quote, only escalate tensions. The president posting on Truth Social at 2:14 a.m., praising the National Guard and criticizing Newsom as incompetent, even calling him new scum. But L.A. Mayor Karen Bass said shortly after that the troops had yet to arrive. CNN national security analyst Juliet Kayyem joins me live now. So, Juliet, tell us about the significance of the events that are unfolding and the implications of Trump's move.
So there's what Trump says he's doing and what is actually happening. And then the second one we don't know much about because we don't know the nature of the deployment or where they've even shown up. But even just sort of going by what he's saying, it is significant because the National Guard traditionally and by constitution reports directly to a governor. They are needed as a sort of additional asset that a governor can use to support local and state entities, local police, emergency management in an emergency or disaster. I used to oversee the state National Guard in Massachusetts. They work in tandem with state and local so that there's rules of engagement, understanding of what the mission is. What Trump did yesterday is not typical and quite extreme given the circumstances on the street. Even though there was unrest, that's why police departments exist. When a president federalizes under Title X, the National Guard, he puts them under his authority to be deployed without knowledge of what the rules of engagement are, what the mission is, how are they going to work with locals, and does have the risk of heightening tensions rather than de-escalating. In law enforcement, you want to de-escalate the tensions, arrest those who have committed crimes, permit First Amendment protest, which is allowed, and not escalate it as Donald Trump did.
So, Juliet, we're expecting more protests today. We're also expecting the troops to actually come on the ground in Los Angeles sometime later today. What are you going to be watching for today as the events unfold? And what if the situation leads to what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said last night? He said if the violence continues there, Marines could be deployed.
Yes, so there's another series of rules regarding whether the military can use law enforcement or serve as a law enforcement agency in the homeland. Some people will know this act, the Posse Comitatus Act. So the deployment of the National Guard under Title X still requires them to take a support mission, at least for now, as far as we know. So it may be that they're just deployed to surround the areas. Again, I am not minimizing the violence that people are seeing, nor that it is unlawful to disrupt immigration, federal immigration proceedings. That regardless of how you feel about ICE. But that, again, is why we have police departments, state police, to stop it, which is essentially what LA and California said. Secretary Hegseth sort of steps in with a tweet late last night saying that he has the active military, the Marines, on standby. We don't know what he meant by that. We know that Secretary Hegseth hasn't been in charge of a military before. We don't know if that was just him sort of waxing, sort of saying what he wants. But that would have to come under the Insurrection Act, and nothing we've seen so far would qualify for the deployment of active military in the United States under the Insurrection Act.
All right, we'll see how the events unfold today. Julia Kayyem, thank you so much for your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Or overnight, President Trump said he would deploy 2,000 National Guard troops to quell clashes in Los Angeles sparked by his administration's sweeping immigration raids there on Friday. Now, in response, the state's governor, Gavin Newsom, said there was no shortage of law enforcement locally and accused the president, who bypassed his authority, of wanting a spectacle, calling the move, quote, purposely inflammatory. It was the first time a president has federalized the National Guard since the Rodney King riots in 1992, and then it was at the request of the governor. Now, overnight, one crowd of protesters in the heavily Latino suburb of Paramount exhibited violent behavior, the LA Sheriff's Department said, including throwing fireworks at law enforcement. Here with me now is California Congresswoman Nanette Berrigan, who represents Paramount. Thank you so much for being here. Let's start with the fact that the president ordered National Guard troops to respond in LA County within the next 24 hours. What have you heard about the situation on the ground? What updates are you getting?
Well, I've spoken to the sheriffs on the ground who have said they have things under control. There's no need for the National Guard. They have the manpower that they need. So this is really just an escalation of the president coming into California. We haven't asked for the help. We don't need the help. This is him escalating it, causing tensions to rise. It's only going to make things worse in a situation where people are already angry over immigration enforcement. They've seen what's happened over the course of the last several months, where you have immigration showing up to hospitals when women are delivering and giving birth and separating parents from their newborns. We're seeing ICE going to schools. And we know that there is no targeted enforcement. That is the problem. Look, nobody disagrees with targeted enforcement of violent criminals. That is not what's happening here. What happened yesterday in Paramount when this started was there was a staging location. We understand that they were going to go into the Home Depot, go after day laborers. I mean, these are people who are looking for work. These are not criminals. They're looking for work. And so protesters came out. It started peacefully. Then we had federal officers, doing the tear gas, shooting out pellets.
Federal officers, you mean ICE?
ICE, yes. And they were shooting pellets. And, people were there to protest. They're there to protest the mass deportations that are happening. And so it was peaceful. And, of course, you escalate the situation. Now you're talking about bringing in the National Guard to militarize the situation. It's going to get worse. It's unnecessary again.
What are you hearing about the National Guard, about how, we understand it's 2,000,
right?
But how long they'll be there, where they will be deployed?
So we've been told to get ready for 30 days of enforcement, 30 days of ICE enforcement. So 2,000 troops to be there for that enforcement. It's a concern. I mean, it's going to escalate the situation. People are going to protest because they're angry about the situation, and we have to just reiterate to people to do it peacefully. To make sure not to any violence. We absolutely condemn any violence.
So you said that you have spoken to the law enforcement officials that you work with in your district.
Yes.
On the ground. The LA County Sheriff's Department did describe the protest in Paramount last night as the situation escalated. The crowd of protesters became increasingly agitated, throwing objects and exhibiting violent behavior toward federal agents and deputy sheriffs. What is your message to people who are getting violent?
It's don't get violent. Those are not the people that are coming out to protest immigration. What we've seen, so let me tell you.
What are violent people doing?
Okay, so last night when I talked to the sheriff, he had told me the situation in Paramount was under control, that the people that were peacefully protest have left. The situation was now across the street into the Compton area, and this was the unruly folks, that Saturday night crowd. The people that were there to actually protest immigration were gone. We agree that if you're being violent, you should be arrested, you should be prosecuted. There is no disagreement on that. I think that's an effort that we can all say. But this is not what's happening. We are having an administration that's targeting peaceful protests, people that are there to protest. The president is sending the National Guard because he doesn't like the scenes. He doesn't like the scenes of people peacefully protesting. And we know that California law enforcement, local law enforcement, they're there to protect the public. They're there to protect and have public safety. And that's what they're there to do. Now, when people turn on law enforcement is when you get that response. So we want to make sure that people continue to speak up, that people show up, but that people are peaceful about the situation. And that's what we're continuing to tell people.
Should the protesters, what's your view on protesters who allegedly try to obstruct what ICE agents are trying to do?
Well, I just tell people, look, be peaceful, have your hands up. Clearly, if you are interfering, they have the ability to arrest you. But what they're doing is they're being much more aggressive than that. Just last night, we saw the video of the federal officers being aggressive with press that had press suits on, that were identifying themselves as press. There is just no regard right now, and that is the concern that we have. And we have to remember why this is happening. It's happening because of everything that's been going on for the last couple of months. And this community is saying, we don't want ICE in our community. We want you out. Now, there's a way to do this, Dana. There's a way to do targeted ICE enforcement. It's been done for a long time. And that's when you're going after criminals. And that is not what's happening. They're stopping anybody that's at a bus stop, that's going to shop. We saw that they picked up a U.S. Marshal and thought he was somebody, and they detained him. So they are picking up innocent people, they're picking up American citizens, and then they're detaining them. Now, we also know, of course, the president of a labor union was assaulted and had to go to the hospital, was hurt. Now he's being detained. It's really out of control.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for being here. I know you're going to have a very busy days ahead of you. It sounds like maybe even 30 days.
Yes,
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
There's this news from overnight about the president deploying the National Guard, federalizing, really the first time it's been federalized since 1992. Are you comfortable with him doing that in California?
Well, let's be clear. Anybody who interferes with the ability of law enforcement to do their job should be arrested and prosecuted. It is a violation of federal and state law. And the fact is that you have these protesters who are interfering with the ability of ICE to do their job and remove dangerous criminals from our country. So if people are interfering with a law enforcement action, then they should be held accountable. And if the National Guard needs to be called up for the purpose of assisting law enforcement, I have no problem with that at all. Again, these individuals who are choosing to violate the law and choosing to interfere with law enforcement activities should be held accountable.
All right. Well, Mr. Lalo, thank you for giving your perspective. Really appreciate that. The governor of California has a different perspective on the use of the National Guard, but that's for another time. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
All right, the city of Los Angeles now worried about even more escalations there. President Donald Trump says that he's deployed the National Guard to quash the ongoing confrontations between ICE protesters and police. Let's get into it. Washington Bureau Chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Tia Mitchell, retired Judge Ashley Wilcott, and podcast host Rachel LaForce are with me for the roundup this morning. All right, so let's start here with these protests. And Tia, I'll come to you first. Is this more about the enforcement of the law or reinforcement of a message for the president?
Well, I think the protests are about how ICE is carrying out its immigration enforcement. But I do think that President Trump is, number one, he's always been kind of critical of public protests. But I also think he's also been very critical of California and governing officials in California. So I think his reaction is a combination of that. And we also know that Trump kind of likes to bring critics and opponents to their knees. So now it's like us versus them. And now I think that's part of the reason why the National Guard is being brought in. That's part of the concern about the National Guard is that Trump has said, I think Trump indicates that he wants to be perceived as winning over now these protests in California.
But the National Guard could escalate everything. I mean, yes, there's a reason for it, a purpose for it, but you got to be real careful because it may just escalate it to a point that's really going to become even worse.
I would agree because I spent a long time in Los Angeles, and I would say very proud people. And we're like, oh, no, send whoever you want. Like, we're here and this is what we're saying. And so I think it's going to be an interesting situation.
And I'm concerned, yes, that bringing in the National Guard could escalate the protests, but that also brings its own risk that there could be, use of lethal or non-lethal force against the protesters, that it could become more violent on both sides. Yeah. There's real risk of injury and harm. We saw that there were some police officers that said they were injured last night. Things could just get more serious and a lot more risk. And I think that's kind of what's being, to me, I read that between the lines when I see the elected officials in California saying they're worried about the escalation.
There's also the concern of the cooperation between local law enforcement and the National Guard, because while it's been decades since the president has federalized the National Guard, the last time it happened was during the Rodney King protest. Governor Wilson asked for those National Guard troops to come in.